On the last morning I would ever stand a full watch, a man I had spent 41 years trying to forget walked in through the west gate of Harrogate Palace and looked straight up at me as if no time had passed at all. I want you to understand what a strange thing that is for a man like me to say. I had stood at that post through 3 coronations, 2 royal weddings, 1 attempted breach that nobody outside these walls will ever hear about, and more state funerals than I care to count. I had stood through blizzards that froze the chinstrap to my jaw and through summer heat that turned the forecourt cobbles into a griddle. I had learned, the way every man of the Royal Watch learns, that the whole art of this life is to not move. Not when tourists press their faces an inch from mine. Not when a child once slapped my knee to see if I was real. Not when my own father died and the message reached me at the gate and I had 2 more hours on my clock and I stood every minute of them. That is the trade. You give the crown your stillness. You give it every twitch, every flinch, every private grief, and in exchange you are permitted to be, for a few hours a day, something better than an ordinary man. A wall, a promise, a thing that does not break. So when I say that a single face walking through the west gate nearly undid 41 years of that discipline in the space of 1 breath, I need you to hear the weight of it. His name was Tobin Rourke. And the last time I had seen him, he had been a boy of 19, weeping in the dark, running from his post while the whole east wing filled with smoke. But I am ahead of myself. Let me stand you where I stood that morning, and let me take you through it the way it came, minute by minute, because that is the only honest way I know to tell a thing. It was the 9th of a cold, bright autumn. My name is Corvin Hale, Sergeant of the Watch, and by order of my own retirement I had exactly 1 day left in the red tunic. 63 years old, 41 of them in service. The younger men had a quiet joke that I had been carved out of the same stone as the gate pillars and simply painted red each morning. And I did not discourage it, because a joke about a man's permanence is a compliment in this trade, whatever it sounds like anywhere else. They had wanted to make a fuss. I had refused. A fuss is for men who need the world to notice them, and I have never been that. There would be a small ceremony at dusk in the stone court. The colonel would say a few words. There would be the striking of my name from the active roll, and I would hand my rifle to the armorer and walk out the tradesman's arch a private citizen for the first time since I was a boy. That was the plan. That was all I wanted. To finish the way I had served, quietly, correctly, without drama. I should have known better. In 41 years I had learned that the day you decide a thing will be quiet is exactly the day the world decides otherwise. The morning began the way 10,000 mornings had begun. Reveille in the barrack block before the light. The cold water on my face. The kit laid out on the bed exactly as it had been laid out since I was 22, tunic brushed, buttons burning, boots I could shave in, the bearskin combed until it looked less like fur and more like a shadow given shape. I dressed the way you dress for a funeral, because in a sense every watch is a small funeral for the man you were the day before, and this one more than most. Corporal Ellery came to inspect me, which was backward. I had inspected that boy 1,000 times, and he found nothing to say, because there was nothing to find, and his voice cracked a little when he told me I was fit for duty, and we both pretended not to notice. Then out into the gray-blue dark, across the yard, under the arch to the west gate, where the night watch handed off to me the way it had handed off 10,000 times, and I took up my post, and I became still. The sun came up over the eastern turrets. The palace woke. The first tour groups gathered at the rail beyond the forecourt, cameras, murmurs, a guide's raised umbrella, the ordinary daily tide of strangers who come to look at men who will not look back. A woman held up a small boy so he could see me. A student sketched me. Someone's phone played a snatch of music before a companion hushed it. The pigeons walked their insolent circuits across the cobbles. All of it flowed past me and none of it touched me, because that is the whole point, and I had 41 years of practice at letting the world flow past. I will not pretend I felt nothing that morning. A man would have to be a stone in truth and not merely in seeming to feel nothing on his last day of a life's work. But what I felt was not what you might expect. It was not sorrow exactly. It was a kind of accounting. Standing there in the first sun, I found my mind going back over the whole span of it. The faces, the seasons, the men I had trained and the men I had buried, the two monarchs I had served and the good queen I served now, and adding it all up, the way a man adds up a ledger before he closes the book. And when a man does that, when he takes the full accounting of his life, he finds always that there is one entry he has never been able to reconcile, one line that does not balance, one night he has carried in a locked room of himself for 4 decades and never shown to another living soul. For me, that night had a name, and the name was Tobin Rourke. I had not thought of him in years, not properly. He had become, over time, less a memory and more a weight, the way an old wound stops hurting and simply becomes part of how you stand. And on that last morning, for reasons I could not have explained, he came back to me whole. The smell of the smoke, the heat of it against the far wall, the sound of a 19-year-old boy trying not to sob and failing, and my own voice, 30 years younger, saying the words I had never told anyone I had said. Go, I never saw you, go. I stood at my post with that memory rising in me like water in a hold, and I did what I had done for 41 years. I did not move. I let it flow past. I told myself, as I had told myself 10,000 times, that it was old and done and buried, that I had made my peace with it, that whatever it had been it was long behind me now. And then, at 11 minutes past 9 o'clock on the last morning I would ever stand a full watch, a man walked through the west gate, past the rail, into the forecourt where visitors are not permitted to walk, and I knew, before my mind could form the name, before my reason could catch up to my blood, exactly who he was. He was old now. Of course he was old. He would be 60 by my count, and the years had done to him what years do, taken the black from his hair and left it white, put a slight forward set into his shoulders, carved lines around a mouth I remembered as smooth. He walked with a cane, though he did not seem to lean on it so much as accompany it. He wore a good dark coat and a plain scarf, and the kind of quiet clothes that a man of means wears when he does not wish to announce his means. And he came across the forecourt slowly, deliberately, ignoring the low call of the sentry at the rail who had already taken a step to intercept him, and he stopped 6 feet from my post, and he looked up into my face. I felt the whole 41 years of discipline strain against what was happening in my chest. I want to try to describe to you what that recognition is like, for a man who has spent his whole life training himself not to react, because it is the strangest sensation I know, and I have felt it only that once. It is like standing very still on the deck of a ship and feeling without any warning the whole sea heave beneath you. Nothing on the outside moves. The deck is where it was. Your hands are where they were. But the entire foundation of the thing you are standing on has lifted and dropped, and only you know it, and you must give no sign. 41 years I had built a self that did not move. And in the space of the time it took that old man to cross the forecourt, that self was tested harder than it had ever been tested by any tourist or drunk or foreign officer, because none of them had ever reached into the locked room. This man was the locked room. This man was the thing the door was built to hold. Because it was him, it was unmistakably, impossibly him. The eyes were the same. A man's eyes do not age the way the rest of him does. They are the one part of us that arrives finished and leaves unchanged, and I would have known those eyes in the dark, at the bottom of a well, 40 more years on. They were the eyes of the boy I had told to run. He said my name, just that, Corvin Hale. A guard on duty does not answer. A guard on duty does not so much as let his gaze drop to the man before him. And I did not. To this day I am proud that I did not, that whatever came up in me stayed down where I had put it, that my chin did not move and my eyes stayed fixed on the far turret over his shoulder the way they had stayed fixed for 41 years. But he saw, Whatever a face can hold when a man forbids it to move, he saw it. He had always seen more than a boy his age had any right to see. He smiled, and it was not a cruel smile, and it was not a triumphant one. It was something far worse than either. It was gentle. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "You never did. I know the rules. I came a long way to break them anyway." The sentry from the rail had reached us now, a good young man named Pharaoh, and he put a firm hand toward Tobin's shoulder and began the practiced, courteous words we use to move a person who has strayed where they should not. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to step back behind the rail." And Tobin, without any fuss at all, reached into the breast of his good dark coat and drew out a folded paper and held it up, not to me, but to Pharaoh. "I have permission," he said, "from the Queen's own household. You'll find it in order." Pharaoh took the paper. Pharaoh read it, and I watched, from the corner of an eye that was not permitted to move, as something changed in the young man's face, as the routine courtesy drained out of it and was replaced by something careful and a little awed. He folded the paper back along its creases and returned it to Tobin's hand, and he did not touch his shoulder again, and he stepped back, and he said very quietly, "Of course, sir. My apologies." And then Pharaoh looked up at me, and in his face I saw the beginning of a question that would spread across the whole of the watch before that day was done. Who is this man, that the Queen herself has cleared his way to the sergeant's post? And what does he want with our sergeant on his very last day? I did not know the whole of the answer yet, but I knew the shape of it. I knew, standing there in the bright cold sun with my heart going like a drum against 41 years of stillness, that the one entry in my ledger that had never balanced was about to be opened in daylight in front of the palace, on the last day I would ever wear the red. Tobin looked up at me a moment longer. Then he did a thing I did not expect. He stepped back, not away, but to the side, out of the direct line of my post, so that he was no longer confronting me but standing beside me, the way a man stands beside a monument. And he lowered himself onto the low stone edge of the forecourt planter, slowly, with the care of an old man who has learned to distrust his knees, and he set his cane across his lap, and he folded his hands upon it, and he settled in to wait. "They tell me you're done at dusk," he said to the air, to the cobbles, not looking at me now. 41 years, then a small ceremony and out the tradesman's arch and gone. He nodded slowly to himself. "That's very like you, to try to leave the way you came, quietly, as if a man could serve 41 years and slip out unnoticed." He turned his head then and looked at me, and the gentleness in his face had a grief folded inside it that I could not read. "I couldn't let that happen, Corvin. I've spent 30 years planning not to let that happen, and I very nearly left it too late." The sun climbed. The tour groups came and went at the rail, glancing curiously at the old man who sat within the forbidden ground and was not moved along. Somewhere behind me in the great stone body of the palace, I would learn later, a message was already moving up through the household. "The sergeant's visitor has arrived. He is at the west gate. It is time," and preparations I knew nothing of were quietly beginning. And I stood my post, and I did not move, and inside the walls of that stillness I was 19 again, and it was the middle of a burning night, and a boy was weeping in the smoke, and I was about to make the choice that had shaped every year of the life I was now one day from leaving. Let me take you to that night. You cannot understand what happened at dusk unless you first understand what happened in the dark, 41 years before. I was 22 that year, and Tobin Rourke was 19, and we were both new enough to the watch that our discipline was still a coat we put on rather than a skin we had grown. The old palace was not the same building it is today. The east wing then was a warren of timber-floored galleries and storerooms and the old servants' stairs, a part of the palace that has since been gutted and rebuilt in stone precisely because of what happened that night. It was a dangerous, beautiful, foolish old wing, full of tapestries and dry oak and centuries of varnish, and it needed only one thing to become a death trap, and one autumn night it got that one thing. I never learned for certain how the fire started. A lamp, they said afterward, A lamp left burning in a storeroom where a footman had gone looking for winter linens and been called away and forgotten it. Such a small thing. The whole of that night and everything it made of two men's lives turned on a lamp nobody remembered leaving lit. Tobin and I were posted that night to the East Wing's lower gallery, an interior post, a quiet one, the kind they give to young men to season them. It was not a glamorous watch. There was no crowd, no ceremony, only the long, dim gallery and the tick of a great clock and the two of us at our separate stations, perhaps 40 feet apart, each of us learning the particular endurance of standing still through the small hours when the whole world is asleep, and there is nothing to guard against but your own drifting mind. Tobin was a good soldier. I want that said plainly and first, because of what comes after. He was quicker than me, sharper than me, better read than me, the son of a country schoolmaster who had joined the watch not out of any family tradition, but out of something like idealism, a boy who had genuinely believed all the fine words about honor and service that the rest of us had learned to say without quite hearing. He believed them. That was Tobin's whole trouble in the end. He believed them so completely that when he failed to live up to them, even for a moment, even under a pressure no man should be measured against, it very nearly killed him. The smoke came before the flame. I remember that. I remember the smell of it reaching me down the gallery, faint at first, a wood smoke smell that a man might mistake for a chimney, until his soldier's nerves told him no chimney draws like that. I remember turning my head, a disciplined breach, but the right one, and seeing the thin gray ribbon slide out from under a storeroom door 40 feet down the passage, lit from within by a flicker that had no business being there. What happens next, when a young guard sees fire in the palace he is sworn to protect, is that his training and his terror go to war inside him, and the outcome of that war is the whole measure of the man. I felt it in myself, the animal part of me that wanted to run, and the trained part that said hold and think and act. I shouted the alarm, the old cry, 3 times that carries down the stone throats of that place and wakes the whole guard. I shouted it, and I heard it taken up somewhere far off, and I knew help was coming. And then I did the thing we were trained to do, which was to move toward the danger and not away from it, to get to the source, to see whether it could be stopped before it grew or whether the wing must be abandoned and sealed. And as I ran toward the smoke, I passed Tobin's post, and Tobin was not standing at it. He was on the floor. He had gone down to his knees against the base of the wall, his rifle fallen beside him, his hands pressed flat to the boards as if he were trying to hold the very floor in place, and he was shaking, the whole of him shaking, a fine terrible tremor I have seen only a few times in my life and never in a well man. His eyes were open and fixed on nothing. And when I dropped down beside him and gripped his shoulder and said his name, he looked at me the way a drowning man looks at the shore, from very far away and with no hope at all of reaching it. "I can't," he said. His voice was a child's voice. "Corvin, I can't move. My legs won't, I can't." I did not understand it then. I understand it now. I have lived a long life and stood beside a great many men, and I have learned that the mind is a garrison like any other, and that even a garrison manned by a brave and loyal soul can be overrun. Some men, in the presence of certain terrors, simply lock. It is not cowardice. I would fight the man who called it cowardice. It is a wound that happens in a place you cannot see, and it happens to some of the finest men, and Tobin Rourke on the floor of that gallery, with the smoke rolling toward us, was not a coward. He was a good soldier whose garrison had been overrun by a thing he could not fight, and he knew it, and the knowing was worse to him than the fire. I had a choice to make, and I had perhaps 4 seconds to make it. I could stay with him, try to lift him, drag him, get him moving, and lose the crucial minutes that might let the fire be checked. Or I could leave him and go to the fire, and trust that the help I'd summoned would find him and get him clear. Or there was a third thing, which is what I did, and which I have turned over in my mind 10,000 times in the 41 years since, and which I still cannot tell you with certainty was right, only that I have never once been able to wish I had done otherwise. I took his face in my 2 hands, I made him look at me, and I said, in the flat hard voice we are taught to use on men who have stopped being able to hear anything softer, "Rourke, listen to me. You are going to stand up and you are going to walk, not run, walk to the west stair, and you are going to go down it and out into the yard and you are going to breathe. That is an order. Your legs will do it if you stop asking them and just start walking. Go now." And he tried. God help me, he tried, and his legs held him for 3 steps and then folded, and he went down again, and I saw in his face that some final thing had broken, that he had failed the one test his whole young idealistic soul had set for itself, and that he would rather die there in the smoke than live having failed it. So I did the thing that was not in any manual, the thing that would follow me for the rest of my days. I hauled him up. I got his arm across my shoulders and I half carried him to the head of the west stair, the smoke thick now and the flame audible behind us, a low tearing sound like cloth. And at the top of the stair, where the air was clearer and he could stand on his own again, I stopped him, and I turned him to face me, and I made a decision that a wiser man or a colder one might not have made. Because here is what would have happened to Tobin Rourke if I had done the correct thing. If I had reported it exactly as it occurred, that a guard of the Royal Watch had abandoned his post and collapsed in the presence of danger, Tobin would have been finished. Not merely dismissed, disgraced. In those days there was no understanding of what had happened to him, no name for it that did not translate, in the mouths of hard old officers, to coward. He would have been drummed out under a permanent shadow. The schoolmaster's son who joined for the honor of it would have carried dishonor to his grave. And I knew it standing at the top of that stair with the fire behind me, that it would kill him. Maybe not that night. But it would kill him slowly, the way a thing like that kills a man who believed the fine words too much to survive breaking them. So I made my choice. I looked at him, and I said the words I have never repeated to a living soul until now. "You were never here," I said. "You hear me, Tobin? When they ask, and they will ask, you were never on this post tonight. You were taken sick before the watch and I stood the gallery alone. I sounded the alarm. I fought the fire alone. You were never here. Now go down that stair and out and away, and don't you come back until you're a man who can stand this post again, and if that day never comes, then you stay gone and you make something of the life I'm giving you back. Go. I never saw you. Go." And he went. I turned back into the smoke alone. I want to be honest with you. What I did next was not heroism, it was arithmetic. I could not reach the seat of the fire, it had grown past checking. So I did the other thing. I went along the lower gallery, pounding on the doors of the sleeping rooms where 2 elderly members of the household staff lodged, and I got them up and out, and I stayed until the palace fire party arrived with their hoses and their axes, and I helped where I could, and when it was over and the east wing was a black wet ruin, but not one soul lost, not one. I stood in the cold yard among the smoke-stained men, and I told the officer who came to take account exactly the story I had told Tobin to tell. I stood the gallery alone. Rourke was sick before the watch. I sounded the alarm and fought the fire and woke the staff. Alone. They believed me. Why would they not? I was a steady young man with a clean record, and the story fit, and there was no one to contradict it. And so a small strange justice happened, the kind history is full of and never records. I was commended. For the same night in which I had told a soldier to desert his post and covered it with a lie, I was commended for steadiness under fire. The colonel of that day shook my hand. There is a line in my record, to this hour, that praises my conduct on the night of the East Wing fire, and every word of the praise is built on a lie I told to save a boy's life. That is the entry in my ledger that never balanced. That is the weight I carried into every one of the 41 years that followed. Not guilt for saving Tobin. I could never manage to feel guilty for that, however hard duty told me I should. The weight was subtler and worse. It was the knowledge that the finest commendation in my record was a fraud, that the honor I was praised for was built on a dishonor, and that I could never, ever set it right without destroying the very man I had lied to protect. So I carried the honor I did not deserve, and I hid the mercy I could not regret, and the two of them sat side by side in that locked room of myself for 41 years, and I told no one, and I stood my watch. I never heard from Tobin Rourke again, not once in all those years. He went down the west stair and out into the dark and out of my life entirely, and I did not know if he had made anything of the life I'd handed back to him or thrown it in a ditch. Sometimes, in the small hours of a quiet watch, I would wonder. I would think, perhaps he drank himself to death within the year. Perhaps he became a criminal, and my mercy loosed him on the world. Perhaps he was long dead in some pauper's grave, and the whole of my one great gamble had been for nothing. A man never learns how his mercies land. He throws the bread on the water and the water carries it away, and he stands on the bank the rest of his life not knowing whether it fed anyone or simply rotted. That is the loneliness of it. You do the merciful thing, and then you must live without ever knowing whether you were a fool. I should tell you, too, what those 41 years did to me, so that you understand the man Tobin found at the gate that morning, and not merely the boy at the top of the stair. A secret carried long enough stops being a thing you have and becomes a thing you are. In the early years after the fire, the weight of it was sharp. I would wake in the night with the smell of smoke in my nostrils and the lie hot in my throat, and I would lie in the barrack dark and turn it over. Had I done right? Had I done wrong? Would the truth come out? What would become of me if it did? But a young man cannot sustain that pitch of feeling, and slowly over the years the sharpness dulled. The secret sank down into the foundations of me and became load-bearing, the way I have told you. And a strange thing happened as it sank. It made me a better guard. I do not fully understand the mechanism of it, but I have had a lifetime to observe the result. A man with a secret he must never reveal becomes, of necessity, a master of stillness. He learns to let nothing show, because he has one enormous thing that must never show, and the discipline required to hide the one thing spreads to cover everything. My whole legendary composure, the thing the young men joked was carved from the gate pillars, grew, I am certain of it, out of the 41-year labor of keeping Tobin Rourke's name off my face. Every provocation I swallowed, every grief I held at the gate, I held it with muscles I had built hiding a greater thing. The tourists who pressed their faces to mine and could not make me blink were up against 40 years of practice at not letting a burning corridor show in my eyes. So the lie made the legend. The dishonor I thought I carried built the honor everyone else could see. I did not understand that until Tobin explained it to me on my last day, but I had been living it, unknowing, for 4 decades. And it made me watchful in a particular way, because I knew, I alone in all that palace knew, that a man may look perfectly steady on the outside and be, at that very moment, a garrison overrun on the inside. I had seen it happen to the finest young soldier I ever served beside. So through all my years of training recruits, I had an eye the other sergeants lacked. I could see the freeze coming in a young man before he knew it himself. I saw it a dozen times over the years. A recruit going gray and still in a way that was not discipline but its terrible counterfeit, the body locking. And where a harder sergeant would have seen cowardice and broken the boy, I saw Tobin on the gallery floor, and I knew what to do. I would get the young man alone and I would take him through it quietly, the way you gentle a frightened horse, and I would give him back to himself before the shame could set. I never told any of them why I understood. They thought I was simply wise. I was not wise. I was a man who had once made a choice on a burning stair and spent his life paying it forward without ever once naming the debt. Every recruit I saved from the freeze was a small secret installment on what I owed for Tobin, and I did not even know I was paying it. The river, it turns out, was running through me the whole time, and I never saw the water. That is what I did not know, standing at my post on the last morning, with an old man in a good dark coat sitting quietly on the stone edge of the planter beside me. I did not know that the bread had landed. I did not know what it had fed. I was about to find out. For the first hour, Tob and Rourke simply sat and talked, and I simply stood and listened. And to any tourist at the rail, we must have made a strange pair. The immaculate red statue and the quiet old man beside it, one of them talking to the air and the other giving no sign of hearing. But I heard every word. I have never in my life listened to anything the way I listened that morning. "I'll tell it to you straight," he said, "because I've had 30 years to work out how to tell it and I still only have the plain words. When I went down that stair, Corvin, I didn't go far. I got out into the yard like you told me and I breathed like you told me, and then I stood at the edge of the yard in the dark and I watched the east wing burn and I watched you go back into it. Did you know that? I watched you go back in. I stood there shaking and useless and I watched a man 3 years older than me walk back into the fire I'd run from, and I made myself a promise standing there. I made it to you, though you never heard it and never would. I promised that if I lived, I'd earn the thing you'd just done, that I'd spend whatever life you'd handed me back making myself into a man who could walk toward the fire." He turned his cane slowly in his old hands. "I couldn't stay in the watch. You knew that. You knew it before I did. That's why you told me to go and not come back until I could stand the post again, and God help me, I never could. Some doors close in a man and they don't open. But you gave me the other half of the order too, and I don't think you even knew you were giving it. Make something of the life I'm giving you back. Do you remember? I have said those words to myself every day of my life for 41 years, every single day. When I wanted to quit a thing, when I wanted to run again, and there were times, Corvin, there were times I'd hear your voice at the top of that stair. Make something of it. So I did." And then he told me what he had made of it, and I will set it down for you as plainly as he set it down for me, because it is the heart of the whole thing. Tob and Rourke had become a physician. Not merely a physician. He had gone from the palace that night, a disgraced boy who believed himself finished, and he had gone home to his father the schoolmaster, and his father had asked no questions and simply taken him in, and slowly over years Tobin had rebuilt himself. He could not walk toward fire, but he found in himself that he could walk toward the sick and the dying, that the terror that had unmanned him in the smoke did not touch him at a bedside, that there was one arena in which he could be brave. So he studied. He had the schoolmaster's brains and the deserter's shame driving him, and he studied medicine with a ferocity that his teachers remembered decades later, and he qualified, and he went to work. And here is the thing he had come to tell me. Here is the bread on the water, come back after many days. "I've kept count," Tobin said. "It's a strange thing to keep count of, and I never told anyone I was doing it, but I kept count because I needed to know. I needed to know that the debt was being paid. In 40 years of practice, Corvin, I have been the physician of record at the deliverance of, I have the exact number, but I won't burden you with it, thousands of lives. Not saved by me alone. No doctor works alone. But present and part of it, and often the hand that made the difference. Fevers broken. Children brought through the night. Mothers and infants both, more times than I can hold in my head. I ran a fever hospital through the great sickness of the northern winters, the year the epidemic came down out of the hills, and we held that line, Corvin. We held it the way you hold a gate, and thousands went home to their families who would not have gone home otherwise. And every one of them, every single life that passed through my hands in 40 years, traces back up a single thread to the top of a burning stair, where a man I'd failed took my face in his hands and gave me my life back and told me to go and make something of it. He looked up at me then, and the gentleness in his face had become something I can only call terrible, in the old sense of the word, a thing that fills you with awe and dread at once. "Do you understand what you did?" he said very quietly. "You've carried it as a shame all these years. I know you have. I know you, Corvin Hale, better than you'd credit because I've thought about you every day for 41 years, and a man learns a thing when he thinks about it that long. You've carried that night as the one stain on a clean life. The lie you told. the commendation you didn't earn. I know it sat in you like a stone, and I've come here on your last day, with the Queen's own leave in my coat, to tell you that you've had it backward your whole life. That wasn't the stain on your service, Corvin. That was your service. That was the truest thing you ever did in that uniform. Everything else you did in 41 years, every hour you stood still, every provocation you swallowed, every grief you held at the gate, all of it was training for the 4 seconds at the top of that stair. And you passed. You passed the only test that ever really counted, and I have spent my whole life being the proof. I want to tell you that I held my discipline. I did. My chin did not move. My eyes stayed on the far turret. But something happened behind my ribs that had not happened in 41 years of standing that post, and I will not pretend to you that it did not, because this is meant to be an honest account, and an honest account admits when a wall cracks even if it does not fall. A single tear came out of my right eye and ran down the side of my face, and I did not wipe it, because a guard on duty does not raise his hand, and so it simply ran its course down my jaw and dropped from my chin, and Tobin Rourke saw it, and he had the grace to look away. "There now," he said softly to the cobbles. 41 years, I knew there was a man in there. There is more I must tell you of that first hour, because Tobin did not stop there, and what he said next reached into places in me I had walled off so long I had forgotten they were rooms at all. "There's a thing I've wanted to say to you for 41 years, he said, still not looking at me, his voice pitched low under the murmur of the tourists at the rail. "And I've rehearsed it so many ways that now that the moment's here I find all the fine speeches have gone and I'm left with the plain truth. When you told me to go, that night, you were never here. You didn't just save my career, Corvin. You didn't just spare me a disgrace. You did a far stranger and greater thing than that, and I don't think you knew you were doing it, and I've spent my life trying to understand it. You gave me back the right to think of myself as a man who could be brave. Do you follow me? If I'd been drummed out as a coward, I'd have believed it. I'd have carried that word inside me, and it would have been the truest thing anyone had ever said about me, and I'd have arranged the whole rest of my life to prove it right. That's what disgrace does. It doesn't punish a man, it defines him, and then he lives down to the definition. But you refused to let anyone put that word on me. And because no one ever said it, I never quite believed it, and because I never quite believed it, I was able, years later, in a different arena, at a different kind of bedside, to find out that it wasn't true, that I could be brave after all, just not in a corridor full of fire. You didn't only give me my life. You gave me the version of myself that could go and earn it. I stood and I listened and I did not move, and the tourists came and went at the rail, and the pigeons walked their circuits, and the whole ordinary daylight world flowed past the two of us the way it had flowed past me for 41 years, and none of them knew, how could they know, that they were watching one man hand another man back the meaning of his own life. I want to tell you about the first time, Tobin went on. The first time I found out I could do it, because I know how you think, Corvin. I know you'll take everything I've told you about the thousands of lives in the fever hospital and you'll hold it at arm's length, because it's too large to fit in a man's chest, and you'll say to yourself, that's very grand, but it doesn't really touch me. I only did a small thing on a stair. So let me make it small enough to touch you. Let me tell you about one. And he told me about a night, perhaps 8 years after the fire, when he was a young physician not long qualified, sent out alone to a farmhouse in a river valley where a whole family had taken a fever, and the river had risen in the rains and cut the valley off, and there was no help coming and no help to send for. A mother and a father and 3 young ones, all of them burning, and one of the young ones, a small boy, sinking fast in the night. And Tobin, alone in a lamplit farmhouse kitchen with the river roaring outside, and no one to consult and no one to blame if he was wrong, had to decide, in the space of a few seconds, on a treatment that might save the boy or might kill him quicker. And I froze, Tobin said. For just a moment I froze, the old freeze, the garrison overrun, the thing that happened to me in the smoke. I felt it come up in me and I thought, here it is, here's the coward again, and a child is going to die because I can't move. And then, Corvin, then I heard your voice, clear as I hear my own now. Your legs will do it if you stop asking them and just start walking. The exact words you said to me at the top of the stair. And I stopped asking myself whether I could do it and I just started doing it. I did the thing. And the boy lived. He lived, Corvin. He grew up and had children of his own in that same valley, and I know that because I went back, years later, and I saw them. And I stood in that farmhouse kitchen at 4 in the morning with a living child breathing easy at last, and I understood for the first time exactly what you'd given me. Not a pardon, a method, a way through the freeze. You'd shown me, on the stair, how a man walks through the thing that stops him, and I carried your method into 1,000 rooms you never saw. He was quiet a moment. So when I tell you thousands, I know it's too big to feel. That's why I gave you the one. The boy in the valley is real. He has a name. He has grandchildren. And he's alive because 41 years ago you took a frightened boy's face in your hands and taught him, without either of us knowing it was a lesson, how to move when everything in you is locked. Multiply that boy by every year I practiced. That's the arithmetic. That's what you did with your 4 seconds. I have stood a great many hard watches in my life. I have stood through cold that cracked the skin and heat that swam the eyes and grief that would have felled a lesser discipline. I will tell you plainly that standing still through Tobin Rourke's account of the boy in the valley was as hard a thing as I have ever done in the red tunic. And I do not fully know how I did it, except that 41 years is 41 years, and the body remembers its trade even when the soul is coming apart inside it. But I have gotten ahead of the day again, and I must slow down, because the morning was not the end of it. It was barely the beginning. What Tobin had told me at my post was the private half of the thing, the debt, come to find me quietly on my last day. What came in the afternoon was the public half, and I had no more warning of it than I'd had of Tobin himself walking through the west gate at 9. Because word had moved through the palace. Of course it had. A palace is a village, and a village keeps no secrets, and the sight of an old man cleared by the Queen's own hand to sit at the sergeant's post on his retirement day had set every tongue in the household wagging by mid-morning. The under-officers came, one by one, on invented errands, to walk the forecourt and steal a look at us. Corporal Ellery came and stood at the rail a long while with a face I could not read. And somewhere in the great state-rooms above, I would learn the thing that Tobin had set in motion months before, the thing he had been planning, as he'd said, for 30 years and very nearly left too late, was quietly coming to its appointed hour. There was a moment in the late morning that I have not yet told you, and it belongs here, because it was the first sign I had that the day was reaching beyond the two of us into the wider world. An old man had joined the tourists at the rail, not a tourist, I saw at once, for he stood the way only an old soldier stands, and he wore, pinned to a shabby but well-kept coat, a small enamel badge that I knew. It was the veteran's badge of the watch, the one a man is given when he leaves the service with honor, worn by those few old guardsmen who still, decades after their own last watch, come now and then to stand at the rail and look at the post they once held and remember the men they once were. I had seen 100 of them over the years. This one was very old, older than me by a good span, and he stood at the rail a long while looking not at me but at Tobin Rourke on the planter's edge, with a slowly gathering expression on his face, as if he were reaching back through 50 years for something. And then I saw him place it. I saw the recognition arrive in his old eyes and his mouth fall open, and his hand go to the rail to steady himself. And he said, loud enough that it carried across the quiet forecourt in the cracked voice of a very old man, "Rourke, Tobin Rourke, God in heaven, I heard you were dead." Tobin turned and looked, and a slow, wondering smile came over his face, and he said a name back, a name I did not catch, and the old man at the rail began, to the bewilderment of the tourists around him, to weep. He had been, I learned later, a young guardsman himself that year of the fire, one of the fire party who had come with the hoses, and he had known Tobin a little in those days, and had grieved him as one of the many who simply vanished from the watch over the years and were never heard of again. And here was Tobin Rourke, 60 years old and alive and cleared by the Queen's own hand, sitting at the sergeant's post on a bright autumn morning. It was, for that old man, a small resurrection. I mention it because of what it showed me, standing there unable to turn my head. It showed me that Tobin had been mourned, that there were men in the world who had carried his loss as a small grief for 50 years, believing the promising young guardsman had come to some bad end. And it showed me in the old veteran's tears a foretaste of what the truth would do when it was finally spoken aloud, that it would not only honor me, it would give back to a whole scattered company of old men the missing end of a story they had wondered about for half a century. Mercy, I was learning, does not only feed the one it is given to. It feeds everyone who ever loved him, and everyone who ever wondered. I only knew, at a little past noon, that the colonel himself came down to the forecourt. Colonel Wren was a hard, fair man of my own generation, one of the few still serving who had known me across the whole span of it. He was not a man for ceremony or sentiment. He had a face like a closed door, and a way of saying the fewest possible words. He came across the cobbles in his greatcoat, and he stopped, and he looked for a long moment at Tobin Rourke sitting on the planter's edge, and Tobin looked back at him, and something passed between the two old men that I did not understand, a recognition, though I would have sworn they had never met. Then the colonel turned to me, and he did a thing that a colonel does not do to a sergeant at his post. He came to attention, and he saluted me. I felt the whole forecourt go still around it, Pharaoh at the rail, the tourists, sensing without understanding that something out of the ordinary was happening, going quiet with their phones half raised. The colonel of the Royal Watch saluting a sergeant. It is not done, it is backward. And Colonel Wren, who did nothing without meaning it, held the salute a full 3 seconds, which in the grammar of the watch is an eternity, a sentence, a whole speech. "Sergeant Hale," he said when he had lowered his hand. His voice was very low, meant for me and the old man alone. "I've had a communication from the Queen's household concerning tonight." He paused, and for the first time in the 20 years I had known him I saw Colonel Wren choose his words with care. "The ceremony is changed. I'm not at liberty to tell you how, but I'm instructed to tell you this much so that you'll be ready. What you think is happening at dusk is not what is happening at dusk. Stand your watch, do your duty, and whatever comes at the striking of your name, hold your discipline, Corvin. You'll want to break it. Don't, not yet. There's a right moment coming and you'll know it when it comes." And with that he turned and walked back across the forecourt and up into the palace, and left me standing there with my heart going and no idea on this earth what he meant. It was not long after the colonel's riddle that Corporal Ellery came to my post, and what passed between us then is a part of this day I would be ashamed to leave out, because it taught me something about the men I had spent 41 years standing beside. Ellery was the young corporal who had inspected me that dawn and whose voice had cracked telling me I was fit for duty. I had trained him from a raw recruit. He was a good soldier, steady and quiet, the kind who will never be a colonel and is worth 10 who will, and I had a particular affection for him that I had of course never once shown, because affection shown is discipline weakened, and a sergeant who lets his men see he loves them will find, sooner or later, that he cannot order them into the cold. So I had kept it locked, the way I kept everything locked, and Ellery had no more idea that I thought well of him than the gate pillar did. He came and stood at the rail, not inside the forbidden ground, he would never have presumed, but at the rail where a man may stand, and he looked up at me, and he was working himself up to something, I could see it, and at last it came out. "Sergeant," he said low, "I don't know who that old gentleman is, but the whole barracks is talking and there's a thing being said, and I wanted to say it to your face rather than have you hear it going round behind you." He swallowed. "They're saying he's come to tell some story about you from the old days, and some of the younger ones, the ones who don't know you, they're wondering aloud if maybe there's something in your record that isn't what it seems. A skeleton like." And I want you to know, Sergeant, that I told them to shut their mouths. I told them I've served under you 6 years and I'd stake my life there's not a false inch in you. And whatever that old man's come to say, it can only be to your credit because I've watched you, and a man doesn't fake what you are day after day, year after year in the cold when no one's looking. That's not a thing that can be faked. So, he straightened. That's all. I just wanted you to know that whatever's coming tonight, you've got men who will stand it with you. That's all. And he stepped back and returned to his duties, and left me standing there with a new and difficult thing to hold. Because here was the cruelty and the beauty of it both, at once. Ellery had staked his loyalty on there being no false inch in me, and there was a false inch in me. There had been for 41 years. The commendation in my record was a lie. The steadiest, most honest thing the boy believed about me was the one thing that wasn't true, and I could not tell him. I stood there, and I let that good young man walk away certain of a thing that was, at its root, false, and I felt the old weight of the locked room press down harder than it had pressed in years. And yet Tobin's words from the morning came back to me and turned in me and began to do their slow work. The lie was in the record, but the truth Ellery had staked himself on, that a man cannot fake what I was, day after day in the cold, that truth was truer than the lie. Ellery was wrong about the commendation and right about the man. And I began to understand, standing there in the gray afternoon, that Tobin had crossed the whole country not to destroy the thing Ellery believed, but to complete it, to reach into my record and pull out the one false inch, and replace it with something truer and harder and better than the lie had ever been. I had spent 41 years dreading the day my secret came out, imagining it as a ruin. Tobin was about to make it a coronation. And the difference between those two, I was beginning to see, lay entirely in what the secret actually was, and my secret, the thing I had guarded in shame all my life, was not a sin at all. It was the best thing I had ever done. Only a man who had never looked at it in daylight could have gone on mistaking it for a stain. Ellery did not know it, but he had given me a gift that afternoon larger than he could measure. He had shown me what my men would think when the truth came out, and it steadied me for the dusk more than all the colonel's riddles. What you think is happening at dusk is not what is happening at dusk. I turned it over and over through the long gray afternoon. I'm not a man who likes surprises. 41 years of standing between the crown and the unexpected will do that to you. And here I stood on my last day with the whole of it slipping out of the quiet shape I had chosen and into something I could not see the edges of. The old comrade returned. The Queen's own leave. The Colonel's salute and his riddle. It was too much. It was everything I had spent a career keeping out of my own retirement, arriving all at once whether I willed it or no. Tobin beside me seemed to read the trouble in a face that was giving nothing away. "You're wondering what's coming," he said. "I won't spoil it, but I'll tell you it's a good thing, Corvin, the best thing I could arrange. I've spent a great deal of these last 30 years, and rather more of my money than a modest man ought to admit, making sure that the story of what you did that night doesn't die with the two of us. Because that's the cruelty of it, isn't it? A man does the finest thing in his life in a burning corridor at night with no witness but a boy he swears to silence, and then he carries it alone for 40 years, and if nothing is done, it dies when he dies and the world never knows. I decided a long time ago that I would not let that happen. Not to you. You gave me my whole life. The least I could do was make sure yours got told." He told me then, in pieces, across the long afternoon, how the thing had come together. And it is a part of the story worth setting down, because it shows what one man will do when a debt sits in him for 41 years and finally finds its hour. He had begun, he said, nearly 30 years ago in a small way, simply writing down, for himself, the true account of the fire, so that it would not be lost if he died suddenly. Then, as the years passed and his own name grew in his profession, he had begun quietly to gather the pieces. The old fire party report, which he tracked to a retired officer's papers. The household ledger of that year, which took him 3 years of patient correspondence to see. the testimony of the two elderly staff I had woken and led out, both long dead now, but both of whom he had found and interviewed while they lived, and both of whom, it turned out, had always wondered about the young guard who saved them and the strange gaps in the official story. He had built the true record the way a mason builds a wall, one stone at a time, over decades, telling no one his purpose. And when it was complete, he had done the boldest thing of his life. He had written directly to the Queen's household and laid the whole of it before them, and asked an old physician of no rank, asking a queen, whether the crown might see fit to honor, on the day of his retirement, a sergeant who had never asked for honor and never would. "I thought they'd never answer," Tobin said, with a dry old laugh. "A stranger's letter about a 40-year-old fire, but they did answer. Your queen answered it herself. Corvin read the whole account, every stone of it, and sent for me, and had me tell her the story to her face in a small room with no one else present. And when I'd finished, she was quiet a long while, and then she said a thing I'll carry to my grave. She said, 'Dr. Rourke, I have a great many guards and they all stand very still, and I have rather taken their stillness for granted, as one takes a wall for granted until the day it isn't there. You've reminded me that a wall is made of men, and that a man may be doing in his stillness a thing more remarkable than anyone will ever see. I should be ashamed to let such a man walk out of my house unremarked. Leave it with me.' And she made it happen. All of tonight, the changed ceremony, the full company, everything. She built it around your one act because a physician wrote her a letter about a fire. I stood and I took that in. That my queen, whom I had guarded for 20 years and never exchanged a word with, had sat in a small room and heard the truth of my one secret from the mouth of the boy I'd saved, and had wept, perhaps, or come near it, and had resolved to honor me. It was almost more than the frozen morning could hold. But Tobin was not finished. But, and here his old voice caught just slightly, and he steadied it, there's a part of it I couldn't arrange with letters and ledgers, a part that even the Queen's household couldn't have found without me, a person I had to go and find and persuade to come, and it took me the better part of a year, and I very nearly failed. I told you I nearly left it too late. That's the part I meant." He looked up at me and his eyes were wet now and he did not hide it. "There's someone coming tonight, Corvin, someone you've never met, and someone I only truly came to know myself this past spring. And when you see who it is and understand what it means, you'll know that the bread you threw on the water 41 years ago didn't just feed me. It's still feeding the world. It never stopped." And that was all he would say. He folded his hands back on his cane and he settled in to wait for the dusk, and I stood my last watch through the longest afternoon of my life, and the sun went down slow and red behind the western turrets, and the shadow of the great gate crept out across the cobbles toward the hour that would change everything. I should tell you what those hours were like inside me, because a man's stillness on the outside is not stillness on the inside, and the whole art of this trade is the distance between the two. For most of the afternoon I was at war with myself over a single question, and the question was this: did I want any of it? Because a part of me, a large, stubborn, 41-year part of me, did not. I had chosen the quiet ending on purpose. I had refused the fuss on purpose. I am not a modest man out of some performance of humility. I am a private man because the work made me one. 41 years of giving the crown every twitch and flinch and grief teaches a man to keep the last rooms of himself locked, because they are the only rooms that are still his. And now here came Tobin Rourke, with the best of intentions and the Queen's leave in his coat, about to fling open the most locked room of all and turn a light on it in front of the whole palace. Part of me wanted to stop it. Part of me, I will confess, was afraid. Because here is the thing about a secret you have carried for 41 years. It becomes load-bearing. You build your whole self around it. And even when the secret is a good one, even when it is a mercy rather than a sin, you are afraid of what happens to the structure when the weight is suddenly removed. I had defined myself, in the deepest place, as a man with one flaw in an otherwise clean service. The night I broke the rules. If Tobin was right, If that night had not been my flaw but my finest hour, then who was I? Everything I understood about my own life would have to be turned over and looked at again. And I was 63 years old and one day from the end of everything I knew, and I was not sure I had the strength for it. I think Tobin sensed some of this, because at one point in the long gray middle of the afternoon, he said a thing that I have kept. "I know you didn't want this," he said quietly. "The fuss, I know you, and I want you to understand that I nearly didn't do it. There were years I thought the kindest thing, the thing you'd want, was to leave you your privacy and your quiet and carry the truth to my own grave and never trouble you with it, to honor your silence by being silent." He shook his old head slowly. "But then I thought, no. That's not mercy, that's cowardice dressed up as respect. A man saved my life and made me hide it from the world for his sake. I've hidden it 41 years. I've kept your secret perfectly. But keeping a secret and burying a truth are two different things, Corvin, and I finally understood which one I owed you. I owe you the truth told, not the secret kept, because the secret was mine to keep and the truth is the world's to have. So I'm sorry, I am truly sorry for breaking the quiet you wanted. But I'd do it again. Some debts you pay whether the man wants paying or not." And I understood him, and the war in me quieted, though it did not end. It never entirely ended. Even now, telling you this, part of me flinches at the exposure of it. That is who 41 years made me. But I understood him, and I let it be. There came a moment in the last hour before dusk when I thought the whole thing might yet come apart, and I want to set it down, because it is the part that taught me the most. A young officer of the household came down to the forecourt in some agitation and drew Colonel Wren, who had returned to oversee the changed ceremony, aside near the gate. I could not hear the words, but I have read men's bodies for 41 years, and I read these too, and I saw the news was bad. The colonel's closed-door face closed further. He glanced once, quickly, toward Tobin on the planter, and then away. And then he came, not to me, but to Tobin, and knelt down on one knee to speak to the old man at his level quietly, and I saw Tobin Rourke's face fall. Something had gone wrong with tonight. I learned the shape of it afterward, though I could piece some of it even then from the fragments that reached me. The person Tobin had spent a year finding and persuading, the someone I had never met, the one who was the true heart of what he had planned, was not coming, or might not come. There had been a delay, a difficulty, some obstacle of the ordinary maddening kind that reaches even into the plans of queens, a missed connection, a failure of arrangements, a message that had not gotten through. The keystone of the whole evening, the thing Tobin had crossed the country and spent his fortune and nearly left too late to secure, was in doubt with less than an hour to go. I watched Tobin's face as the colonel told him, and I watched something in the old man collapse, not dramatically, but in the way of an old man who has spent his last strength on one thing and just been told it may have been for nothing. He put a hand over his mouth. His eyes went bright and wet. And he said something to the colonel that I could not hear, and the colonel shook his head slowly, and I understood that whatever it was out of their hands now, and had come down, as these things do, to chance and to time. And here is what I learned, standing there watching an old man's life's work teeter on the edge of failure in the last hour. I learned that I did want it after all. The instant I saw it might be taken away, the instant I saw Tobin's face fall and understood that the thing he had built might crumble at the last, every part of me that had spent the afternoon wishing for the quiet ending fell silent, and a different thing rose up in its place, and the thing that rose up was this: no, not for my sake, for his. For that boy at the top of the stair who had spent 41 years turning my 4 seconds of mercy into a life of it, and who had crossed the whole country to lay the accounting of it at my feet, and who deserved, God, how he deserved, to see it land. I had been afraid of the light being turned on my locked room, and now, watching him, I found I would have torn the door off its hinges with my own hands to give him his moment. That is a thing the trade never taught me, and Tobin's return did. That the deepest reason to accept an honor is not for yourself. It is for the ones who need to give it, To refuse it is not always humility. Sometimes it is a theft. You rob the giver of the gift. I had spent an afternoon nearly robbing Tobin Rourke of the one thing he had lived 41 years to do, and I had called it modesty, and it had been, in truth, only fear wearing modesty's coat. So I did the one thing I could do, which was the only thing I have ever really known how to do. I stood my post. I held my discipline. I fixed my eyes on the far turret going dark against the reddening sky, and I sent out from the stone of myself the only prayer a guard knows how to pray, which is not made of words but of endurance. Let it come, whoever it is, whatever it is. Let it reach the gate in time. I will stand here and hold the way open as long as there is breath in me. That is all I have ever been able to offer anyone, a held gate, an open way, a man who does not move so that others may pass. And as I stood there in the failing light, holding that wordless prayer, I understood at last the thing about my whole life that I had never quite been able to name. All those years I had thought the essence of my trade was the standing still, the refusal to move, the wall, the statue the young men joked about. But it was not the standing still. It had never been the standing still. It was the holding open. A gate is not a wall. A wall keeps everything out, but a gate is a wall with a way through it, and a guard is not the stone of the gate but the man who decides what may pass. 41 years I had stood at the gates of that house, so that the right things could pass through, and the wrong things could not, so that a queen could sleep safe, and a child could be led away from harm, and a frightened boy could go down a stair into a life he would never have had if the gate had been only a wall. My stillness had never been the point. My stillness had been the price I paid for the right to hold the way open. And now, on my last night, everything in me was bent to holding one last way open, the way for an old man's life's work to reach him before the light failed entirely. Let it come. I will hold the gate. It is a strange thing to discover the meaning of your whole life in the last hour of your last watch, standing in the cold with your heart breaking and your face giving nothing away. But that is when it comes, if it comes at all, not in the years of doing the thing. In the last hour, when you finally see what the doing was for. The last light drained out of the sky. Lanterns came up along the forecourt and in the great windows of the palace above. The tourists had long since been cleared for the evening, and the forecourt that is by day a river of strangers became, as it becomes every night, a still and private place belonging only to those who serve there. And I heard from within the palace the sounds of the changed ceremony beginning to gather, footsteps, the murmur of an assembling company, the particular charged quiet of a great house preparing to do something it considers important. Tobin had composed himself. He rose from the planter's edge slowly with his cane, and he came and stood beside me one last time before it began, and he put his old hand flat against the stone of the gate pillar beside my post, the way a man touches a thing he loves. "Whatever happens now," he said quietly, "whether the last piece comes or not, I need you to hear one thing from me directly, in case the rest of it fails. I have lived a good life, Corvin, a useful one, a life worth the trouble of living, and every day of it was a gift from a man who took my face in his hands in a burning corridor and refused to let the world throw me away. I don't know if you've ever let yourself believe that your quiet years meant anything. Men like you rarely do. So let me be the one to tell you, on your last night in the red, standing at your post, your quiet years meant everything. They meant me. They meant everyone I ever saved. You have no idea, you truly have no idea, how far the light of one merciful act will travel, or how many hands it will pass through, or how long it will go on giving warmth after the man who struck the spark has forgotten he ever struck it. You forgot. I never did. And tonight, if God is kind and the last road holds, you're going to see it with your own eyes." And from somewhere deep in the palace, a bell began to toll the hour of dusk, and the great doors at the head of the forecourt stairs swung slowly open, and the changed ceremony began. They came out of the palace in a column, and it was not the small quiet striking of a name I had asked for. It was the full watch. Every man off duty that night, and a good many who had traded shifts to be there, came down the forecourt stairs in the lantern light in full ceremonial order. The whole company of the Royal Watch in red and black, ranks perfect, boots striking the stone as one, and they formed up in a great three-sided square around the forecourt with my post at the open end, so that I stood at the mouth of them, the whole company facing in toward the gate I had guarded, toward me. I had drilled most of those men. I had inspected them, corrected them, buried 2 of their fathers, stood beside them through nights they and I would carry to our graves. And now they stood in their hundreds in the lantern light with their eyes front and their discipline flawless, and I understood that they had turned out, every one of them, to honor a sergeant who had asked for no honor at all. I knew those men. That was the thing that nearly finished me before the Queen ever spoke a word. Not strangers turned out for a stranger's honor, but every one of them a man I knew. There in the front rank stood Corporal Ellery, his eyes front and shining. There was Pharaoh, the young sentry from that morning, who had read the Queen's paper and understood before any of us that something rare was in the wind. There were men whose fathers I had buried, and men whose weddings I had stood guard at, and men I had hauled up out of their own frieze on cold parade grounds over the years, never telling them why I knew how. Some of them were gray now themselves, sergeants and corporals with their own recruits to gentle. Some were boys not 6 months in the red. And every single one of them had come, traded a shift, given up a night's leave, stood in the cold to honor a man who had done nothing all his life but stand still and ask for nothing. It is a thing you cannot buy and cannot order. A company cannot be commanded to love a man. It can only be earned, 1 cold watch at a time, over 41 years, without ever once meaning to. I had not known I had earned it. I had thought I was only doing my duty, and here it stood, in ranks in the lantern light, come to tell me otherwise. Behind them on the forecourt stairs, the household gathered, the under-officers I had served with, the old armorer who had cleaned my rifle for 30 years, and who I now saw had a hand pressed to his mouth. Colonel Wren at the head of them in full dress, his closed-door face open now in a way I had never seen it, and behind him, coming down the stairs with her ladies and her small entourage, in a plain dark gown with a single order of the crown at her breast, the Queen. Queen Saralind of the House of Harrogate had reigned over Eldermore for 20 of my 41 years, and I had stood a great many watches in her presence. But she had never in all that time addressed one word to me, because that is the proper distance between a monarch and a sergeant of her guard, and neither of us had ever thought to breach it. She came down the stairs now and crossed the forecourt to a place before my post, and she stopped, and she looked up at me the way Tobin had looked up at me that morning, and there was in her face something I had not expected from a queen, a plainness, an ordinariness, the face of a woman about to do a thing that mattered to her personally and not merely to her crown. "Sergeant Hale," she said. Her voice carried in the still lantern-lit air, pitched for the whole company to hear. "For 41 years you have stood the gates of my house and the house of my father before me. You have asked nothing. You have taken nothing. You would have walked out the tradesman's arch tonight and let us forget you if we had let you. We are not going to let you." And then Queen Saralind did a thing that made the whole company draw a single silent breath, and made the old armorer on the stairs put a hand to his mouth, and made me understand exactly why Colonel Wren had warned me at noon to hold my discipline whatever came. She held out her hand, and one of her ladies placed into it a folded document with the great seal of the crown upon it, and the Queen unfolded it, and she read it aloud into the dusk. It was the record of the East Wing fire, the true record, the one Tobin Rourke had spent 30 years, and a fortune assembling from every corner it could be dug out of the old fire party reports, the household ledgers, the testimony he himself had at last set down and sworn, the whole reconstruction of a night that only 2 living men had ever known the truth of. "On the night of the East Wing fire," the Queen read, "the record of this house has for 41 years commended the steadiness of one young guardsman who, it was said, stood his gallery alone, sounded the alarm, fought the fire, and woke the sleeping staff to safety. That record is accurate in every particular but one. He did not stand alone. She paused and let it land, and every man in that company stood frozen, because a watch lives and dies by the exactness of its records, and here was the Queen herself unpicking one before their eyes. A second guardsman stood the gallery that night. A young man of 19, who in the presence of the fire suffered a collapse of the body's own governance. A thing we now have the wisdom to call an injury, and had not then the wisdom to call anything but shame. And the older guardsman, 3 years his senior, was faced in the space of 4 seconds with a choice between his duty as it was written and his duty as it truly was. And he chose to carry that young man to safety, and then to shield him from a ruin he did not deserve, at the cost of taking a lie onto his own record, and a commendation he knew he had not earned. A commendation he has carried as a private shame for 41 years, rather than let it be known that a frightened boy was ever anything less than perfect on the gates of this house. The Queen lowered the document. She looked up at me, and the whole forecourt was silent enough to hear the lanterns hiss. "That older guardsman," she said, "was you, Sergeant Corvin Hale, and this house has spent 41 years commending you for the wrong reason. Tonight, before your whole company, I correct the record, not to strip the honor, to tell the truth of it. The steadiness under fire was real, but the true valor of that night was not that you fought a fire. It was that you understood, at 22 years old, with 4 seconds to decide, that the deepest duty of a guardsman is not to the rulebook, but to the human being the rulebook exists to protect. You looked at a broken boy, and you refused to let this house break him further. You have believed for 41 years that you dishonored your service that night. Sergeant Hale, you defined it. I held my discipline. I do not fully know how, but I held it, because Colonel Wren had told me to, and because 41 years does not come undone in an hour, however hard a night presses on it. My eyes stayed front. My chin did not move. But the tears came now, and I let them come, and they ran down the sides of my face in the lantern light in full view of my whole company, and not one man among them thought the less of me for it, because every one of them understood that there is a kind of weeping that is not weakness but the overflow of a thing too large to hold, and this was that kind. And then the Queen said, "There is one more part of tonight. It does not come from me. It comes from the man who spent his life making sure this day would happen, Dr. Rourke." And Tobin Rourke, standing beside my post with his cane and his good dark coat, stepped forward into the space before the Queen and the company, and he turned to face the forecourt stairs, and he called out in a voice that shook and steadied and shook again, a single name. "Come out, my dear, it's time, he's here, it's all right, come out." And from the shadow of the great doors at the top of the stairs, where she had been waiting all this while, a woman came out into the lantern light and started down toward us, and I looked at her, and I did not understand, and then I did understand, and understanding it very nearly finished what the whole day had begun. She was young, perhaps 23, and she was in uniform, not the red ceremonial of the watch, but the deep blue field dress of the Queen's own nursing corps, the service that runs the fever wards in the frontier stations and goes toward the sick and the dying the way we go toward the gate. She came down the stairs and she stopped beside Tobin, and she took his old arm, and she looked up at me with eyes I knew, because they were Tobin's eyes, the eyes I had known in the dark 41 years before, arrived finished and unchanged, in a face 2 generations younger. "Corvin," said Tobin, and he could barely get it out. "This is my granddaughter, this is Win, she's a nurse. She spent the last 2 years running a fever station on the northern frontier, in the same hills where I ran my hospital in the great sickness, holding the same line I held that you gave me the life to hold." He pressed his lips together and mastered himself. "And this spring, when I finally told her the whole of it, the fire, the stare, the man who saved me, she said a thing to me that made me realize I had to do this, and do it now and not leave it another year. She said, 'Grandfather, if that man hadn't taken your face in his hands, I wouldn't be here, and neither would anyone I've ever saved.' And she was right. Do you see it now, Corvin? Do you see how far it went? You saved me, and I saved others. And she is one of the others. She is the mercy, 3 generations on, still going, still saving lives on a frontier you'll never see. This is what your quiet years meant. This is the bread on the water. Here she stands in uniform, alive because of 4 seconds at the top of a burning stair. When Rourke let go of her grandfather's arm, and she came the last few steps across the cobbles to my post, and she stopped before me, and she came to attention. A nurse of the corps, saluting a sergeant of the watch, and she held it, and her young voice rang out clear and steady in the still air. "Sergeant Hale," she said, "I've never met you before tonight. But I've known you my whole life without knowing your name, because you're the reason my grandfather lived, and my grandfather is the reason I live. And I am the reason 41 people came home off that frontier this past winter who would not have come home otherwise." She paused, and I saw her gather herself, and when she went on, her voice had in it the particular steadiness of a young person who has already seen more of death than most old ones. "I want to tell you about one night, sir, because my grandfather told me you'd need it small enough to hold, the way he needed the boy in the valley. This past winter, on the frontier, the fever came down hard out of the hills, worse than anyone alive remembered, and there were 3 days when it was only me and 2 others holding a station meant for 10, with the passes snowed shut and no relief coming. And on the second night I hit the wall. I'd been awake 2 days and I'd lost 3 patients I couldn't save, and there was a whole ward of them still burning, and I stood in the doorway of that ward at 3 in the morning and I felt myself lock. Just stop. The same thing that happened to my grandfather in the smoke, the family curse, I used to call it before I understood it. I stood in that doorway and I could not make myself go in, because going in meant more of them might die in my hands, and I didn't think I could bear it. And I nearly turned around. I nearly walked out into the snow. The whole forecourt was silent, not a boot shifted. And my grandfather's voice came to me, Wynne said. The words he'd given me, the words you gave him 41 years ago at the top of a stair. Your legs will do it if you stop asking them and just start walking. I stopped asking. I walked into that ward, and we held it, sir. 3 of us, 3 more days until the passes opened. And when I counted afterward, because he taught me to count, so I'd know the debt was being paid, I counted 41 souls who walked out of that station alive who would not have if I'd walked out into the snow instead. 41. The same as your years of service. I didn't plan that. God knows I didn't plan it. But when I saw the number, I thought, that's not a coincidence I'm going to let pass unspoken. 1 life for each of your years, sir, this winter alone, and there'll be more. There'll be more every year I serve. That's what you made. Not a lie on a record. A river, and it's still running. It ran through my grandfather to me, and it'll run through me to whoever I teach, and it will not stop, sir. It will not stop long after all 3 of us are gone. I broke. I want to be honest with you, because I have been honest through this whole account, and I will not lie to you at the end of it. I broke my discipline. For the first time in 41 years of standing that post, I moved. I brought my rifle to the rest. Correctly, the way a man secures his weapon, and then I did the thing a guard on duty never does. I stepped down from my post, and I went to my knees on the cold cobbles before that young nurse and her old grandfather, not from weakness, for my legs held me fine, but because there are moments in a man's life when to remain standing would be the failure and to kneel is the only honesty, and I knelt, and I bowed my head. And I wept the way a man weeps perhaps once in his life, in front of my queen and my whole company, and the 2 people who had crossed a lifetime to find me. And no one moved to raise me. The queen did not. The colonel did not. Not one of the hundreds of men in that square so much as shifted. They let me kneel. They understood, all of them, that this was not a breach of discipline to be corrected, but its consummation. The one moment in 41 years that all the stillness had been saving itself for, the way a bow saves all its tension for the single release of the arrow. I had held my post for 41 years so that, on the last night, I might have the right to leave it for this. And it was Tobin Rourke, the boy I had once hauled up a burning stair, who reached down now with his old hand and helped the old man, that boy's savior, had become back up onto his feet. There is a thing that happens to a company of disciplined men at a moment like that one, and I have only ever seen it a handful of times in my life. It is not applause. The watch does not applaud. It is not cheering. We are not made for cheering. It is a sound that begins somewhere in the ground and rises through the boots of hundreds of men standing in ranks. The deliberate, rhythmic strike of one gloved hand against a rifle, and then another, and then the whole company, all of them at once, striking the salute beat in perfect time. It is the watch's highest tribute, kept for the burial of a fallen comrade and for almost nothing else, and I had beaten it myself over the coffins of better men than me, and I had never once imagined I would stand in the open end of the square and hear it beaten for me while I still breathed. It rolled around that forecourt in the lantern light like a great slow heartbeat, and it went on, and I stood in the middle of it with Tobin's hand still on my arm and Win at his side and the tears drying cold on my face, and I let it wash over me, and for the first time in 41 years I did not try to hold anything back, and I did not need to. When it ended, and a company knows, without any order, exactly when a thing like that has been fully said, the Queen stepped forward once more. "Sergeant Hale," she said, "I had intended tonight only to correct your record and to let you meet the proof of your life's work. But standing here, I find I am not willing to let you walk out my arch into an idle retirement, and I do not think, whatever you told your colonel, that you truly want one. So I am going to make you an offer, and you may refuse it, and no man here will think less of you if you do. But I hope you will not refuse it." She glanced at Winrourke in her blue field dress, and then back to me. "The Queen's own nursing corps trains its people to go toward the fire, toward sickness, toward the frontier, toward every place the rest of us flinch from. But they are young, most of them, and frightened, most of them, in the way all brave young people are frightened, and they have never had among them a man who knows in his own bones what it is to stand still in the presence of a terror and not run, what it costs, how it is done, how a person survives the 4 seconds in which everything in them says flee." She smiled, and it was a real smile, the smile of a woman who has just thought of something good. "I should like you to teach them, Sergeant Hale. Not medicine. Dr. Rourke's granddaughter can teach them that. Discipline, stillness, the art of the held gate, how to stand in the smoke and not break. There is no man in my kingdom better fitted to it, and there is a certain rightness, I think, in the man whose mercy built that river being the one to teach the ones who keep it running. Will you take the post?" I looked before I answered at the 3 of them standing together in the lantern light. The Queen who had built this night out of a stranger's letter, the old physician who had spent 30 years and a fortune and the last of his strength to reach me before the light failed, and the young nurse in blue with her grandfather's eyes, who was the living proof that the whole long gamble had been worth the making. And I understood that the Queen had not offered me a consolation, a soft place for an old man to see out his days. She had offered me the one thing I had spent the whole afternoon learning I still wanted more than rest, a way to keep the gate open, to take the 4 seconds on the stair and turn them, deliberately now, knowingly now, into a method I could hand to 100 frightened young people who would carry it to 1,000 bedsides I would never see. She was offering me the chance to make the river wider on purpose, having made it once by accident. No man who understood that offer could refuse it. I did not have to think about it. I think I had known, somewhere, from the moment Winrourke came down those stairs in blue, that my quiet years were not going to end but only change their uniform. "Your Majesty," I said, and it was the first word I had spoken aloud in that whole forecourt, the first word I had spoken on duty in longer than I could remember, and my voice came out rough and strange to my own ears, and I did not care. "I will take the post." And that is how a man who walked toward his post one last morning, meaning to slip quietly out the tradesman's arch at dusk, instead walked, at the end of that night, up the great forecourt stairs, and into the next chapter of a life he had thought was finished. But I am not quite done, because a story owes you its threads tied off, and there are two more I have not tied. The first is the record. The queen was as good as her word and better. In the weeks that followed, the true account of the East Wing fire was set down in the permanent record of the watch, not to erase the old commendation, but beside it, so that any young guardsman who reads the history of this house will find, in the same hand, both the steadiness under fire and the truth of what steadiness really was that night. And they gave the thing a name, because the watch names its honors, and the name they gave it was not mine and was not Tobin's. They called it the Merciful Gate, and they made of it a small annual honor, given each year by vote of the company, to the guardsman who has best understood that the deepest duty of the uniform is to the human being the uniform exists to protect. I am told the young men compete for it fiercely, and that it has already in its first year been given to a corporal who broke protocol to carry a collapsed old veteran out of the summer heat at the rail, and I am told that the corporal wept when he received it, and I am glad. That is the river, still running. That is how you make a mercy outlast the man who struck the spark. You give it a name, and you let it become a thing other men reach toward. The second thread is when she had come to the palace that night. I learned, not only to honor me, but because of a decision she had made and had asked her grandfather to help her keep secret until the moment was right. Win Rourke had served her 2 years on the frontier fever stations, and she had done extraordinary things there, and she could have had her pick of postings anywhere in the kingdom. And she had chosen, instead, to request a transfer to the palace itself, to the household medical service, to the small, quiet corps of physicians and nurses who care for the men and women who serve inside these walls. She had chosen, in other words, to come and serve at the gate, the same gate her grandfather had stood at 19 and fled from in the smoke, the same gate I had held for 41 years. She had come, 3 generations on, to close the circle, to take up her own watch at the place where the whole river had begun, and to spend her life there, healing the ones who guard the house that once nearly broke her grandfather and instead, through one man's mercy, made him. And so it happens, more days than not now, that when I come down in the early morning to teach the young people of the corps their drills of stillness and discipline in the old riding yard, I find that one of the instructors already there before me, laying out the day, is a young nurse in blue with her grandfather's eyes. We do not make much of it. We are neither of us people who make much of things. But sometimes, in the gray light before the others come, she will look up from her work and I will look up from mine, and we will hold each other's gaze for a moment across the yard, the old guardsman and the young nurse, the two ends of a mercy 41 years long, and neither of us will say a word, because there is nothing that needs saying that the silence does not say better. Tobin comes to visit when his health allows, which is less often now than it was, for he is an old man and grows frailer, and both of us know that one of these visits will be the last. We do not speak of that either. He sits in the sun of the riding yard and watches his granddaughter and me put the young ones through their stillness, and sometimes he falls asleep in the warmth, and I watch him sleep, the boy from the burning stair, safe now and old and full of years. There is one more thing I want to set down, and then I am done, because it is the thing I find myself turning to most often in the quiet hours, and a man should end an honest account with the truest thing he knows. On the night of the ceremony, after the company had dispersed and the lanterns were being taken in and the great forecourt had returned to its ordinary dark, Tobin and I were left alone for a few minutes at the foot of the stairs, the young nurse gone up to be settled in her new quarters, the queen withdrawn, the colonel about his duties. 2 old men in the cold, the way we had been 2 young men in the smoke, at the 2 far ends of one long life. And Tobin said a thing to me, then, that I have kept above all the rest. "I've thought a great deal," he said, "about why it was you and not another man. There were braver guards than you in the watch that year, Corvin and harder ones and cleverer ones, Any of them might have been on that gallery instead of you. And I've come to believe that if any of them had been, I'd have been finished. A braver man would have gone to the fire and left me to the record. A harder man would have reported me as I deserved. A cleverer man would have found a reason it was wisest to. It took a particular kind of man to do what you did. A man ordinary enough to understand fear, and stubborn enough to defy the rule book, and kind enough to spend his own honor buying back a stranger's. You've spent your life thinking you were nothing special, just a man who stood still. But standing still is the easy part, Corvin. Any statue can stand still. The hard part, the rare part, the part that only comes once in a great while in a great many men, is knowing the one moment when you must not. You knew it. On a burning stair with 4 seconds, at 22 years old, you knew the one moment in 41 years of stillness when the whole meaning of your discipline was to break it for the sake of a frightened boy. That's not nothing, old friend. That's everything the uniform is for. Everything else is just the waiting. And then he was quiet, and I was quiet, and we stood together in the dark forecourt a while longer, and neither of us said anything more because everything had been said. I think about the 4 seconds in the quiet hours, and I marvel, the way a man marvels at a thing too large to hold, at how much life can grow from so small a seed of mercy, and how long a man may carry a thing as his shame before he learns it was the truest thing he ever did. I stood the gate of that house for 41 years, and I thought my whole worth was in the standing. It was not. It was in the one moment I stepped away from the post to carry a boy up a stair, and in the 41 years I spent believing that moment was my failure, when all along it was the reason I was there. The stillness was never the point. The stillness was the waiting. And what I was waiting for, though I never knew it, was the chance to do the one moving thing that would outlast me. The mercy that is still this very morning, out on some frontier I will never see, wearing a blue field dress in my old friend's eyes, going toward the fire, keeping the line, saving the lives that will save the lives that will save the lives, on and on, long after the old guard at the gate has laid down his rifle for the last time and gone quietly, at last, the way he always meant to. Out the tradesman's arch, into the dark and home.